Bottom line up front, AI chatbots are to LLM systems what the penny-farthing was to the bicycle. Hear me out.
What? Hear me out.
You have all heard the story in many forms before. Some technologies are so revolutionary, so important, so disruptive, that just because they've been invented in the first place, they will change the world. The stirrup, invented in 5th century in China, arrives in Europe by the 8th century. Because it allows someone to wield a sword on horseback, medieval feudalism ensues. Same area, farther away, the composite bow, little short curly bow, gets the same draw force, the same poundage, it's a technical archery term, same draw force as a 6-foot solid oak English longbow, but in half the size, right? It layers, cleverly laminates materials with different elastic properties in the belly and the back. You don't need to know that. You can now shoot a bow on horseback. Again, horseback warfare. One thing leads to another, and Genghis Khan, having conquered most of Asia, will pass on his Y chromosome to 8% of males from the Korean peninsula all the way to the Black Sea. Closer to our time, the bicycle lets Victorian women access mobility, since horse riding would jostle their fragile insides and risk sinful friction. You let that brew for a couple of decades, blammo, you get suffragettes and the whole of modern feminism. This line of thinking, this way of looking at key technologies as causing tremendous social change downstreams, is called technological determinism. It makes for neat stories, like the ones I've just told. Stories that present the status quo as inevitable once the technological artifact exists. Now, history rarely has control groups, so this causal relationship is only a hypothesis, as whole historical relationships are. Yet, this particular hypothesis is seductive, because it works backwards from the present. It does not consider counterfactuals, like what alternative social movements the same technology could have enabled, say, an equilibrium of power between warring kingdoms in Asia. Nor does it consider what alternative technological artifacts, before that, could have been adopted, say, the penny-farthing. In the 1980s, an alternative way of looking at the reciprocal interaction of social and technological development arose, the social construction of technology, SCOT. It, too, is a theoretical perspective. It's a bundle of unfalsifiable hypotheses that cannot be shown to be correct. Again, that's history for you. It doesn't do control trials. Just like there are insights to be gained from looking at history through the lens of technological determinism, SCOT offers another lens for inquiry, and in this area it's less about an exclusive claim to truth as it is practical utility, being useful in making sense of things. SCOT is to technology what EPOR, the empirical program of relativism, had been to science when it emerged in the previous decades, in the 70s. It comes itself a decade after Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution in the 60s. EPOR was an initiative in the sociology of science seeking to empirically demonstrate that even in the hardest of natural sciences, like astrophysics, it had an element of epistemic relativism, that scientific truth was ultimately socially constructed. Those ideas were the late 20th century's manifestations as regards science and technology of epistemologies that arose at the turn of the century in broader sociology, moving past narrow positivism towards social constructivism. The idea that social truths are not absolute Platonic truth, merely applying to the social world. They are instead negotiated consensuses emerging from social groups. In other words, social truths are socio-cultural constructs. The bicycle, with all of its wonderfully weird early iteration, was the first history used to illustrate the role that social groups play in the development of a technological artifact. Wiebe Baker, born 1951, a Dutch sociologist of science and technology who, like me, trained as an engineer, introduced SCOT by making the case for SCOT by retracing the early history of the bicycle. Yes, once there has been closure onto a particular implementation of the artifact, social change would ensue. But prior to this, new technology is in a state of interpretive flexibility in which the problems it solves and the types of solution it offers are up for grabs, to be negotiated through the interplay of social forces. Now, are you starting to see the AI angle? Baker would go on to illustrate SCOT with other examples, the light bulb or bakelite. So it's Baker's Bicycles, Bulbs and Bakelite book. But here, I'm committed to a bicycle bit, right? Before drive chain transmission, pedals were on the front wheel. It was a start to a solution of the broader mobility problem the bike was trying to solve, but it brought another problem. That was speed, or lack of speed initially, because without gears, the only way to roll a longer distance for the same turn of pedals was to make the wheel larger and larger and larger, hence the penny-farthing. Now, it looks absolutely ludicrous in hindsight that such a design could ever have been thought to be a viable implementation of the bicycle. Yes, it has a higher speed, but at a tremendous price for safety, not to mention an unwieldy form factor. The sight of a mustachioed London hipster transporting their penny-farthing on the tube is a reminder that whilst technology design always involves trade-off between form and function, it takes a special type of man, because it's almost always men, to deliberately choose a considerably more expensive design that fails at both. And yet, when it came out in the 1870s, the penny-farthing was incredibly popular. The best incarnation of the bicycle, promising speeds never achieved before, so much so that one would need a chin strap for their top hat. A symbol of freedom, it birthed cycling as a sport. The additional danger brought a frisson to the young dandies, and the penny-farthing was an acceptable solution to this particular relevant social group, Scott term, but not so to, say, older people or women. Designs using drive chains, nearly 20 years later, would solve the speed problem with a better safety profile. It was even called the safety bicycle. But even lower to the ground, that speed didn't help the problem of vibration from the road surface. A problem of comfort more than safety. This problem was to be solved by air-filled tires, also in the late 1880s, but initially they weren't much loved on aesthetic ground. Their offering of solutions to vibration wasn't deemed worth the fugly look, particularly for the dandy crowd. But because there's a limit to the speed that can be reached in practice on a wobbly bike, when the social groups that foremost care about speed noticed in sport cycling that air tires increase speed, there was a social redefinition of the problem solved by those tires from one of comfort to one of speed. This is what Scott calls closure, an end, or certainly a reduction to interpretative flexibility, towards a common interpretation of the technology as a particular artifact or set of artifacts. The road bike, the cross-country bike, the folding bike, etc. Different user groups will have different technological frames. They're like Kuhnian paradigms, right? Sets of values, ideas, and behavior through which they have their understanding of the technology and its artifacts. From its inception, for some, the bike is for transportation. For others, it is sporting equipment. Some care about comfort, others about speed, etc. Closure is the collapse of this diversity of frames into, if not a single one, a smaller set of intercompatible frames shared by larger sets of people, eventually entire societies. The bike as we have it now. You say bicycle, people have a specific image in mind, they've got a couple of different types of machine for uses, it makes sense. Now, of course, like all things, this closure is provisional. Le dérailleur, electric assistance, tandems, recumbent bikes, where you kind of like pedaling lying down. Each innovation around the technology will reopen this interpretive flexibility and calls for another round of social construction, of collective negotiation between different groups, users, manufacturers, cultural commentators, and if applicable, regulators. Technology doesn't just happen. When a technological artifact comes into your hands, that's the result of a series of decisions made by real people based on actual motives, collective incentives, personal hopes and fears. The bit of tech that changes society has been shaped by society in the first place.
Which is really, really important.
And this is where you say, cool story, Barad, but what does it have to do with ChatGPT and AI chatbots? Well, hear me out further. The software techniques that underpin AI chatbots have been around for more than a decade. Now they use deep learning via artificial neural networks that are modeled as linear algebra, which are even older techniques dating back to the work of Minsky and Papert in the 1960s. The release of ChatGPT was a low-key research preview, but it ended up so high-key we have forgotten it was meant to be a preview of research. This is experimental technology, evidently as regards user safety. Vector embedding, to turn words into a word space, that appears in the 2010, and there's already a number of useful applications for natural language processing back then, translation, etc. The transformer model is from 2017. People were building really useful language AI on top of OpenAI's very own GPT-2, then GPT-3, for translation, writing assistance, both fiction and non-fiction, and the kind of chatbot useful for customer service who take unstructured input in natural language, so you ask something in a text box, and return entries in a knowledge base, or perform basic triage before escalating to a human. Note that none of those applications talk back to you. AI that talk back is dangerous, because it's trained to maximize how human it seems. It leads to stories like that of Blake Lemoine. A Google engineer working on their LLM, tuned for dialogue application, Lemoine started claiming in the summer of 2022 that the chatbot had become sentient, and the chatbot wanted the world to know. So Lemoine announced it first within the company, then he announced it to the world, which got him fired. Now you would think this would have acted as a cautionary tale beyond Google, where, to their credit, they clearly had ChatGPT-like chatbots in the works, but they were cautious in their deployment. Then OpenAI jumped the starter gun, and everyone had no choice to follow, because user safety is only of concern to shareholders if it is proxied by profit. There are many wonderful applications to LLM. Just the ability to issue in English relatively complex instructions to find information or organize documents, that is a killer feature to any operating system or cloud storage platform. It could have been like that. But chatbots play on humans' natural tendency to anthropomorphize or otherwise ascribe agency to inanimate objects. AI chatbots are a more successful penny-farthing, equally dangerous, slightly ridiculous if you take a step back and think about critically for a minute, but so alluring it is closing down our interpretive flexibility, with the chatbot assistant and more generally the dialogue interface becoming the expected norm for generative AI. When you use a ChatGPT, I'm using this as a common noun, like this.
Here's some money, go see a Star Wars.
Alright, when you use a ChatGPT to summarize a document or rephrase an email, there is no technical reason for this to happen as a dialogue with a system that speaks in the first person. The fact that the bot is presented as a general anthropomorphic assistant that does everything blurs the line between use cases that LLMs do well, like rewording the email to your boss, and those it does less well, like counseling and emotional support regarding your relationship to your boss. It is also social, and in the past 2 years, political forces. That means you find yourself using as a therapist a system whose understanding of therapy comes from fiction, because web-scraped training data hardly contains any actual therapy transcripts. When actually there are specialist systems developed just for this purpose that have passed actual clinical control trials. Gigantic multimodal frontier models promised economy of scale that they failed to deliver. Right? Language models being more effective and more efficient when trained for specialized application. Effective as in quality of output, efficient as in energy. Not to mention, on smaller models, that the training data size is more manageable, and so its contents are easier to curate, defending against the problems of the worst type of biases. But having one bot for everything suits the ambitions of the owners of the big model. You're using them for all those applications because they're already in an app on your phone or an open tab in your browser. That's because in spite of the contradictions and dangers of the design becoming more and more apparent, the tremendous success of the ChatGPT has gotten penny-farthing's obscene amount of investment. AI companies running foundation models have a vested interest in your using them for everything. I would say financial interest if they were not currently increasing their losses with each additional query. The financial interest is reflected in the equally obscene valuation of those companies, is predicated on the possibility in the future of monetizing our dependency on it, the information it has about us, not just from metrics of views, like on TikTok and YouTube, but from the text we have willingly input into it. Yeah, I've noticed I went from you to us, switched in the middle. But once comes the time to cash in, a ChatGPT, any ChatGPT, will have years worth of personal information on each regular user to be monetized in ruthless and careless ways if the platforms that have embedded themselves into our daily lives are anything to go by. It took nearly 20 years for social forces to push the design, then adoption of features making the bicycle safe and useful. The interest of manufacturers aligned with the safe and useful bicycle because it will sell more. The only incentive for AI companies is to maximize usage, which is users' attention, time, and data input. In the excitement of ChatGPT's launch, we are settling towards the least safe and most ecologically damaging LLM artifact, We should have a variety of bikes for a variety of uses, right? Road, cross-country, folding, electric, rental. Instead, we are getting plenty of manufacturers pushing us onto a universal penny-farthing to be used for everything. Let's not do that. Let's have a better bicycle.